She couldn't hear the sirens. She couldn't hear the bombs. She couldn't hear the orders barked by Nazi officers patrolling the docks. In a world of deafening war, her silence was her greatest weapon. At just 17, Elise Moreau carried nothing but a weathered toolbox and an impossible mission: to send a German destroyer to the bottom of the harbor, using only her wits, courage, and the tools her father had taught her to use. What the Third Reich would never understand is that sometimes those who cannot hear the war are the ones who change its course forever. Before German boots marched through the cobblestone streets of her coastal French village in 1941, Elise Moreau lived in a world defined by light and vibration, rather than sound. Born deaf in 1924 to a shipwright father and a seamstress mother, Elise's childhood unfolded in her father's workshop overlooking the harbor of Saint-Nazaire. While other children played with dolls, Elise learned to feel the pulse of engines, to understand the language of machines through touch. Her father, Marcel, refused to treat his daughter as disabled. "Your eyes see what others miss," he would write to her in their shared journal. "Your hands understand what metal wants to become." By 15, she could disassemble and reassemble a boat engine blindfolded, interpreting the health of machinery through vibrations that traveled up her skilled fingers. In their small community, Elise was known for her brilliant smile and the notepad she carried everywhere, sketching rather than speaking to communicate with the hearing world. Her mother had dreams of sending her to a special school in Paris, saving every franc from her seamstress work for Elise's future. But the war had other plans. June 1940. France fell with a swiftness that shocked the world. By winter, Saint-Nazaire's strategic harbor, with its massive submarine pens and repair facilities, became one of the Reich's most prized possessions on the Atlantic coast. The U-boats that would terrorize Allied shipping now called Elise's hometown their sanctuary. For Elise, the occupation first arrived as strange vibrations, the rhythmic march of boots she couldn't hear but could feel through the floorboards. Then came the visual assault: swastika flags draped across familiar buildings, checkpoints at every corner, and soldiers who would mock her when she couldn't respond to verbal commands. The shipyard where her father worked was immediately commandeered. Marcel Moreau, like other skilled laborers, was forced to repair German vessels. Each night he returned home with darkening eyes and trembling hands, writing less and less in their shared journal. On a frigid morning in February 1941, Elise watched from their apartment window as her father and 5 other shipwrights were lined up against a wall. A German officer had discovered sabotaged parts in a U-boat engine. Though Elise couldn't hear the gunshots, she saw her father's body crumple to the ground. Her mother's screams were silent to her, but the vibration of her mother falling to her knees shook Elise's world forever. 3 weeks later, her mother was taken away for questioning after distributing bread to Jewish families in hiding. She never returned. Alone at 17, Elise watched from the shadows as the massive German destroyer Adler docked for repairs after being damaged in an engagement with British forces. The ship that had likely sunk dozens of Allied vessels now sat vulnerable in her harbor, the harbor where her father had taught her every secret of ships and their weaknesses. This was the moment she realized she could not stay silent. Grief transformed Elise into a ghost. Without the ability to hear approaching danger, she learned to become invisible. The German soldiers rarely glanced twice at the deaf girl with the toolbox who cleaned workshops at the shipyard. Her disability made her beneath suspicion. Who would entrust important information to someone who couldn't even hear? This underestimation became her greatest asset. Within weeks of her parents' deaths, Elise was approached by Madame Bouvier, the elderly librarian who had always been kind to her. Through carefully written notes, Madame revealed herself as a contact for the nascent French resistance. "Your father helped us," the note explained, "and now we need your special talents." The resistance needed eyes inside the shipyard, someone who could document German naval movements and repair schedules, someone who could identify vulnerabilities in the vessels that sheltered there, someone the Germans would never suspect. Elise's training was unlike any other resistance fighters. While others learned to use radios and weapons, she perfected the art of observational drawing, creating detailed schematics of German vessels from memory. She learned to identify patrol patterns by tracking shadows across the ground. Most crucially, she discovered how to use her toolbox as both disguise and weapon. Her first missions were simply to observe and report. Madame Bouvier would pass her drawings to a British contact who crossed the channel under cover of darkness. But Elise hungered for more direct action, particularly when she learned the destroyer Adler was scheduled to return to active duty in just 2 weeks after its repairs were complete. This ship had sunk 3 Allied transport vessels carrying troops and supplies, including, possibly, the medical ship her older brother had served on before disappearing at sea. No one suspected that the quiet girl in the market was carrying the Allies' future in her pocket. Detailed plans for her most audacious act yet. The German destroyer Adler was the pride of the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic Fleet. At 127 meters long and armed with 5 5-inch guns and multiple anti-aircraft batteries, it had become the terror of Allied shipping lanes. Now it sat in dry dock at Saint-Nazaire, undergoing repairs to its propulsion system, after sustaining damage in an engagement with British destroyers. Elise's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Unlike elaborate explosives or coordinated attacks that required multiple operatives, she would use her intimate knowledge of ship mechanics to ensure the Adler would never leave port again, or if it did, would fail catastrophically at sea. Her first mission began at dawn on April 12, 1941. With her toolbox in hand and wearing the gray maintenance coveralls that had become her uniform, Elise approached the checkpoint to the shipyard. The guard barely glanced at her workers' papers, forged by the resistance, but rarely scrutinized when presented by the simple deaf girl known to clean the workshops. The spring morning cast long shadows across the docks as Elise made her way toward the imposing silhouette of the Adler. Her heart pounded so violently she could feel it in her throat, but her hands remained steady. She had spent her entire life learning to communicate through expressions and body language. Now she used that skill to project nothing but casual indifference. The first phase of her plan required access to the engine room. As the morning shift of German engineers and forced French laborers focused on the destroyer's damaged starboard side, Elise slipped through a maintenance hatch on the port side. The vibrations of the ship changed as she descended deeper into its steel heart. Fewer footsteps, more mechanical thrumming as systems were tested. In the relatively deserted auxiliary machine room, Elise removed the false bottom of her toolbox, revealing the tools her father had made specifically for her. Tools designed for sabotage. With methodical precision, she located the backup hydraulic systems that controlled the rudder mechanisms. Here, she made her first modifications, subtle changes that would go unnoticed during standard tests, but would fail catastrophically under the pressures of open sea navigation. As she worked, a sudden change in vibration alerted her to approaching footsteps. Elise barely had time to slide beneath a workbench before 2 German engineers entered, conducting an inspection. Unable to hear their conversation, she watched their boots from her hiding place, counting the seconds until they moved on. One engineer dropped a clipboard that landed inches from her hand, a moment when discovery seemed certain. But they retrieved it and continued their rounds without looking beneath the equipment. But she didn't know the Gestapo was already watching the shipyards more closely following recent acts of sabotage in other ports. For her second mission 3 days later, Elise targeted the fuel filtration system. A vulnerability her father had once explained was common to all large vessels. "Contaminate the fuel at the right point," he had written in their journal, "and the damage spreads throughout the entire system." Using a specially designed tool that could inject a corrosive compound into sealed systems, she introduced a substance that would gradually degrade the metal components, ensuring that any contamination would be attributed to poor maintenance rather than sabotage. The most dangerous mission came on April 17th, just 3 days before the Adler was scheduled to return to active duty. Security had tightened considerably after suspicious damage had been discovered on another vessel in the harbor. Now Elise needed to access the main engine room, the most heavily guarded section of the ship. She arrived at dawn as usual, but this time carried a stack of requisition papers provided by a resistance contact working in the shipyard office. The forged documents indicated she was delivering specialized cleaning supplies for the engine components. A believable cover given her known role as a maintenance worker. At the gangplank, a suspicious officer stopped her, examining her papers more carefully than anyone had before. He barked questions at her that she couldn't hear. When she pointed to her ears and shook her head, his frustration grew visible. The critical moment came when he motioned another guard over, seconds away from her plan unraveling. It was then that Oberleutnant Kraus, the engineering officer who had often seen Elise working in the shipyard, intervened. Unknown to Elise, Kraus had a younger sister with a similar disability back in Germany. He dismissed the guards with a sharp command and waved Elise through with barely a glance at her papers. This unexpected mercy would haunt Elise later. In the main engine room, surrounded by the massive propulsion systems that powered the destroyer, Elise executed the most critical part of her plan. Using her father's tools, she made minute adjustments to the main shaft bearings. Adjustments that would cause catastrophic failure once the ship reached high speed in open water. She then sabotaged the warning systems that would normally alert the crew to dangerous overheating. As she finished, alarms suddenly vibrated through the hull. A surprise inspection had been ordered, directly toward the engine room. Trapped deep within the vessel, Elise hid her specialized tools and desperately searched for an escape route. Finding none, she made a bold decision. She would hide in plain sight. When the inspection team burst in, led by a Gestapo officer, they found only a deaf girl cleaning engine components, seemingly oblivious to the alarms. The officer's suspicion was immediate. He circled Elise like a predator, firing questions she couldn't hear, and studying her body language for signs of deception. This mission would become her last chance to complete her sabotage. In a moment of quick thinking, Elise pointed to her unfinished cleaning work and then to her watch, indicating she was simply trying to complete her assigned tasks. The Gestapo officer remained unconvinced, but the engineering officer, Kraus, intervened again, explaining that she was a reliable worker who couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated workings of the engines. After a tense inspection of her toolbox, which now contained only standard cleaning supplies, the specialized tools hidden within a disassembled pipe, the officers allowed her to continue working under supervision. For 2 excruciating hours, Elise had to pretend to clean while knowing her sabotage remained incomplete. Only when the inspection ended and the officers departed did she retrieve her hidden tools and finish the final critical adjustments that would doom the Adler. As she worked, her fingers traced a silent promise to her father. The destroyer would never sink another Allied ship. On April 19, 1941, the day before the Adler was scheduled to depart, disaster struck. A dock worker who had witnessed Elise accessing restricted areas of the ship reported his suspicions to a German officer. By midday, the Gestapo had launched a full investigation, questioning everyone who had access to the destroyer during its repair period. Elise was returning home from the market when she noticed unusual movement in the streets. German patrol vehicles moving with urgency, soldiers stopping young women for document checks. Though she couldn't hear the commotion, the visual pattern screamed danger to her trained eyes. Taking a circuitous route, she reached Madame Bouvier's library, hoping to find guidance from her resistance contact. Instead, she found the elderly librarian being forced into a Gestapo vehicle, blood trickling from her temple. From her hiding place behind a stone wall, Elise watched in horror as Madame Bouvier's eyes found hers across the square. With the smallest shake of her head, the older woman warned Elise away. With her heart shattering, Elise slipped away, knowing that to approach would mean capture for both of them. Her safe house compromised, her identity likely exposed, she had nowhere to turn. As night fell, she made her way to the harbor, driven by a desperate need to know if her sabotage would still succeed. From the shadows of a bombed-out warehouse, she watched as German officers and engineers swarmed the Adler, conducting emergency inspections. Had they discovered her work? Would they find the subtle alterations that would send the destroyer to the bottom of the Atlantic? As dawn broke, she witnessed Oberleutnant Kraus being escorted from the ship in handcuffs. The kind officer who had unwittingly allowed her sabotage was now paying the price for her actions. The weight of this unintended consequence pressed on her conscience like an unbearable burden. History would remember what she did next. With the Gestapo closing in, Elise made the heart-wrenching decision to flee Saint-Nazaire. Using forged papers provided earlier by the resistance, she boarded a supply truck bound for Nantes, hiding beneath crates of vegetables. From there, she made her way south toward the unoccupied zone of France, traveling only at night and avoiding all military checkpoints. What Elise didn't know as she fled was that her sabotage had already been partially discovered, but not all of it. German engineers had found and repaired the damage to the hydraulic systems, but in their haste and confidence, They missed the more subtle sabotage to the engine shaft bearings and fuel filtration system. On April 23, 1941, the Adler left Saint-Nazaire harbor with great ceremony, heading to intercept an Allied convoy in the North Atlantic. 17 miles offshore, traveling at full combat speed, the destroyer's engines catastrophically failed. The compromised bearings seized, the contaminated fuel system ignited, and a series of explosions tore through the vessel's midsection. The proud destroyer listed heavily to starboard and sank within 30 minutes, taking 173 German sailors to the bottom of the ocean. Elise eventually made her way to Switzerland with the help of resistance networks, where she spent the remainder of the war working in a hospital for wounded refugees. She never spoke of her actions in Saint-Nazaire, carrying the weight of both her success and the unintended deaths her sabotage had caused. It wasn't until 1967 that British naval intelligence declassified documents revealing the mysterious sabotage of the Adler, an operation they had attributed to an unknown resistance cell codenamed Silence. When French authorities connected these reports to witness statements from surviving shipyard workers, they finally identified the deaf teenager who had single-handedly crippled a Nazi destroyer. In 1972, at age 48, Elise Moreau was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government. In a private ceremony she requested remain unpublicized. She accepted the honor not for herself, she explained in writing, but for her father, mother, and Madame Bouvier, none of whom survived the war. Elise lived a quiet life as a mechanical engineer in Lyon until her death in 2003. In her personal journal found after her passing, she had written, "I never heard the explosions that avenged my family. I never heard the screams of those who drowned because of my hands. In the silence that was my life, I learned that victory and tragedy share the same face." Today, in the Maritime Museum of Saint-Nazaire, a small display contains a weathered toolbox and a photograph of a teenage girl with serious eyes. The plaque beside it reads simply, "With these tools, she changed the course of a war. Her name may fade on paper, but her courage never will."